I'd pegged Joelle Fenwick for a company spy before she'd worked a single full shift, and on the morning of the dedication, I still believed it. 11 years on the hospital's volunteer honor guard teaches a man to read a room fast, and the room around Joelle had never sat right with me. She'd transferred into outpatient 3 months earlier, quiet, capable, the kind of nurse who never raised her voice and never needed to. But she'd also walked out of a closed-door meeting with the hospital aboard the same week budget cuts hit the Veterans Outreach Program. And 2 days after that, Carol Adler started keeping her at arm's length from everything that mattered. Carol ran that program like it was her own child. She didn't trust Easy, and she trusted Joelle Fenwick least of anyone on staff. I'd watched it build for weeks. Joelle left off the planning emails. Joelle handed the least important task in any room. Joelle's name skipped over twice when volunteers were assigned to work directly with veterans, like Carol was protecting them from her rather than the other way around. Nobody said the word informant out loud. Nobody had to. The morning of the wall dedication, Carol said it almost out loud anyway. Triage table only, she told Joelle, loud enough that half the courtyard could hear it. Stay in your lane today. She's not cleared for this, not after where she's been sitting lately. She didn't look at Joelle when she said it. She looked past her, the way you look past something you've already decided isn't worth the eye contact. Joelle didn't argue. She never did. She set up her table along the courtyard fence, laid out gauze and glucose tablets, and a blood pressure cuff like she expected to use every bit of it. And then she stood quietly behind it and watched the folding chairs fill with old men in pressed jackets and younger ones in wheelchairs, some of them still wearing the look that never quite leaves a face once it's been there. I watched her watch them. There was something in it I couldn't place. Not curiosity. Not duty, either, not the ordinary kind. Recognition, maybe, though I wouldn't have called it that at the time. At the time, I just thought she was casing the crowd for whatever she was going to report back. The wall itself was 11 feet of polished gray granite, 200 names cut into it, going up that morning under a sky the color of an old nickel. I stood post near the podium in my dress jacket, spine straight, doing what 11 years of these ceremonies had taught me to do: count the crowd, watch the gate, ignore the ache that lives permanently in my left knee. Carol gave her speech about sacrifice and service, and the debt a community owes its own. The mayor gave his, shorter and worse. And then, 3 rows back, a man named Charlie Abernathy, Korea, 2 campaigns, 91 years old and proud of every one of them, went the color of wet ash and stopped being able to get a full breath. It happened the way these things always happen, fast and a little ugly, and over before most people understand it started. His daughter screamed his name. 2 folding chairs went over sideways. By the time I'd covered the distance, Joelle was already down on one knee in front of him with 2 fingers at his throat and her eyes on her watch, talking to him low, and even like the chaos around them simply wasn't permitted to exist. Sir, look at me. Just me, nobody else in this courtyard, just my voice. She had his collar open and his airway clear before the responding EMT had cleared the gate. She had oxygen running off her own kit before anybody thought to ask where the kit had come from. She had his breathing leveled out and his daughter's hand gripped tight inside of 30 seconds, and none of it looked like luck and none of it looked like panic. It looked like a procedure she had run 100 times somewhere a great deal worse than a hospital courtyard, somewhere that didn't give you 30 seconds to get it right. Carol watched from the podium with her hand pressed over her mouth and didn't move an inch. I watched too, and for the first time in 3 months, I felt the shape of my own certainty crack a little at the edges, the way ice does right before it goes. It didn't crack all the way until the second thing happened, and the second thing happened because of an old man in a wheelchair near the back row, a man I clocked as nothing more than another name on the guest list. He'd been there the whole ceremony, off to the side, not speaking to anyone, a command sergeant major's rank still sewn, crookedly, the way old soldiers do it when they can't quite let a thing go, onto the collar of a civilian jacket. The program had him down as Earl Driscoll, 81, invited because his late brother's name was one of the 200 cut into that granite. He hadn't moved through the whole ceremony except to lift his hands for the anthem. Joelle finished with Abernathy, handed him off to the paramedics rolling through the gate, straightened her back, and crossed the courtyard. Not fast, not obvious, just a nurse checking on an elderly attendee, the kind of motion that wouldn't draw a second look from anyone who wasn't already watching her the way I was. She knelt down beside Driscoll's wheelchair, said something I didn't catch, and then she did something with her hand that I saw clearly in the moment and could not make sense of. 3 short taps against her own collarbone, a half-second pause, a flat palm held still, and then nothing. Quick, deliberate, gone almost before I trusted that I'd seen it. God help me. My first thought was that she was passing him something, a message, a signal meant for somebody connected to the board, some piece of business that had nothing to do with an old man at a memorial. I started across the courtyard toward them, ready to do the one thing 11 years on this detail had trained into me without my ever once having to use it. I didn't get 3 steps before Earl Driscoll's wheelchair brake locked under his hand, and he came up out of that chair on legs that had no business holding an 81-year-old man steady, and he answered her. 3 taps, a flat palm, and then his right hand came up into a salute, so sharp it looked like holding it cost him something physical. The courtyard went quiet in pieces, the way a held breath spreads outward from one set of lungs to the next. Carol stopped mid-sentence at the podium, her mouth still open on a word she never finished. The mayor turned around in his chair, and from a back row, 2 men I'd written off as nothing but guests in folding chairs, one in a windbreaker, one leaning hard on a cane, were already on their feet and already moving, coming to attention beside Driscoll like they'd spent years waiting for somebody to finally give the order. "Crosswire," Driscoll said, and his voice didn't shake even though the rest of him did. "Confirm." "Confirmed, Sergeant Major." Joelle's voice hadn't changed at all from the one she'd used on Charlie Abernathy's airway. "Steady straight through. The gap's clear." I didn't understand the words. I understood the men. The one in the windbreaker, Master Sergeant Lyle Doss, I'd learned within the hour, was crying without making any effort to hide it. The man with the cane kept saying her name over and over like it was the only word left to him, and it wasn't Joelle he was saying. It was Crosswire. Like that was who she actually was, and Joelle Fenwick was the visiting name she wore on a Tuesday shift. Driscoll turned from the men to the crowd, and then specifically to Carol, who hadn't left the podium and looked like she'd forgotten the use of her own legs. 14 years ago, on bar, he had to stop once to get his breath under him before he kept going. Comms down. 2 units cut off from each other in a sandstorm so thick you couldn't see your own hand, and the only thing holding the line between us was a 23-year-old combat medic running on foot because the radios were dead and the GPS was worse. She crossed that gap 4 times that I know of. The last time, she came back carrying Doss here because his leg wasn't going to carry him and the line he was holding needed somebody to hold it in his place. He had to stop again. Nobody in that courtyard tried to fill the silence while he found the rest of it. I put her in for the Joint Service Commendation Medal with Valor myself the same week. They moved me stateside before the paperwork finished, and after that I never knew where she'd landed. "I landed here," Joelle said quietly. "Triage table. Tuesday through Saturday." Carol made a sound that wasn't quite a word and pressed her hand over her mouth again, differently this time. I thought about 3 months of watching this woman the way you watch a stranger you've already convicted of something, and I had to look down at the gravel for a second because 11 years on this detail had never once prepared me to be the man left holding nothing to offer. Driscoll wasn't finished. He reached into the same crooked collar jacket and brought out a small velvet box, gone soft and gray with 14 years of being carried and never delivered. "Kept it on me every year since," he said. "Wasn't about to mail it to an address I never had." His hand wasn't steady when he held it out to her, but it didn't waver either. "Better late than never, Sergeant Fenwick." She took it with both hands, the way you take something heavier than its actual weight. Doss and a man with the cane closed in on either side of her, and for a long moment, the 4 of them simply stood there in the gray morning light, in front of 200 names cut into granite, saying nothing at all, while the rest of us in that courtyard worked out how to start breathing normally again. Carol came down off the podium last of anyone. She crossed slow, like she was rehearsing the words with every step, and when she finally reached Joelle, she didn't bring up the board or the budget or 3 months of arm's length. She just said, "I'm sorry," and then said it again, quieter, and put her hand briefly over Joel's hand on the box before she could think better of it. I walked Driscoll back to his wheelchair afterward because that was the job and because I wanted an excuse to stand near it a little longer. "You knew her," I said. It wasn't really a question. "I knew Crosswire," he said. Took me until she opened her hand to know I'd found the same woman wearing a different name. He looked up at me with the particular patience old soldiers keep in reserve for civilians who are catching up slow. "You watch her cross that courtyard like she was up to something." I did. She was, he said, up to the only thing she's ever been up to. Making sure the man in front of her keeps breathing, whether anybody's watching or not. He let that settle, then added it quieter still. "Doesn't always come with a uniform on. Sometimes it comes in scrubs and gets told to stay in its lane." I didn't have an answer for him then, and I'm not sure I've found a better one since, except that I've stood post at a dozen ceremonies since that morning, and I watch differently now. I watch the quiet ones. I watch the ones who don't ask the room for its attention, because I learned the hard way that the ones carrying the most never do. The wall still stands in that courtyard. 200 names, and one small brass plaque added later, set low on the granite where a person has to kneel to read it. It doesn't say medic. It doesn't say hero. It says Crosswire and the date, and 4 words under that. She held the gap. I read it every time I pass it now. Nobody's ever had to tell me twice what it means.